There's three different administrations that had in a way, policies that affected you. And I would like for you to summarize for us, because in your book, you really come out strong against Biden. And I find that very fascinating because as in politics over here, yes, we saw what happened under the Biden administration, and some might chalk it up to just politics. But I want people to understand it wasn't just political optics. What exactly happened on the ground? So Obama's the one that announced the withdrawal and set a date. How did that change the military tactics with the Taliban?
So initially, when President Bush was in charge in 2001, the American troops came in. It was the Afghan resistance that took over the country. There was a handful of American special forces embedded with the Afghan resistance, and of course, with the robust U.S. air support. But all the ground, every province collapsed under the force of the Afghan resistance. The Taliban run away into Pakistan, most of them, but a lot of them were killed and arrested as well. After that, we started rebuilding our military, our police, our infrastructure, and the relationship between America and Afghanistan became very, very close. The two presidents, President Karzai in Kabul and President Bush in Washington, really got along very well. They talked to each other, they listened to each other, they listened to the soldiers, and they have provided everything that the soldiers needed to have in order to win the war and also develop a strong ally for America in South Central Asia. When President Obama came, he was very upset with the way President Bush treated Afghanistan and treated our president, Hamid Karzai. He immediately picked up a fight with our president, and he didn't like our president. And at one point, President Obama and his team tried to overthrow President Karzai from his presidency, and they couldn't because President Karzai was very popular in Afghanistan. So he became the president, and he really then, he hated President Obama hated President Karzai. So then the relationship was very, very bad and ruined. And the U.S. requested to sign a bilateral strategic agreement. President Karzai refused because he knew that President Obama's team was trying to overthrow him. So he asked, we need guarantees, and there were no guarantees. So President Obama then wanted to pull out all the troops and leave Afghanistan, but he wanted to do it gradually. That's when a lot of Afghanistan's neighbors, like Iran, Russia, and other countries, including Pakistan was already supporting the Taliban. They're like, oh, okay, the U.S. troops are leaving, so we better support the Afghan Taliban to topple the Afghan government, because if the U.S. troops leave and the Afghan government still remains here, this is a U.S. ally, and, we will not be able to do things in this region. And we were building a strong military. So that actually removed the deterrence posture, deterrence effect of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, and then everybody knew that the U.S. was leaving. Well, that was not enough. Then President Obama went on and dug out some of the Taliban prisoners who were in Guantanamo Bay, and one of the key Taliban leaders who was in prison in Pakistan. He took them into Qatar, and he started negotiating with them about Afghanistan. At the time, the Taliban were very weak. They had no place in Afghanistan. They were doing irregular warfare and insurgency. And this gave them a political posture and, representation as well. And since then, the Taliban had fought stronger with the backing from our, neighboring countries, and also started growing into a more conventional military force. When President Trump came and the Doha Agreement was signed, this was signed without our consent, without our permission, without our participation. So the Afghan government was not party to anything that was signed. This was a unilateral American approach with the Taliban, and then Zalmay Khalilzad, Ambassador Khalilzad, who signed the agreement with Secretary Pompeo beside him, really, really killed the legitimacy of our government. And Afghan government was never seen the same. And then once the Taliban became, okay to talk to, then you had China, Russia, Germany, many other nations rush into talking the Taliban, Norway, and helping the Taliban in a way as well in terms of the negotiations. Towards the end of the presidency of President Trump, the situation got bad, and President Trump gave a green light to the military to restart preparations for joining the Afghan military against the Taliban. Unfortunately, he was, he didn't win the re-election, so he left office and President Biden came. When President Biden came, we thought okay, he's a career politician. He knows the consequences of the fall of Afghanistan. Of course, he will remain. But unfortunately, he just immediately announced we're leaving without considering any consequences. And he said we're not bound by anything. And that started a series of events that culminated in the fall of our country, Afghanistan. Since the fall, our country was taken by terrorist organizations, but also America's reputation was strategically destroyed and damaged. America's access to the heart of Asia was cut off, and then the American rivals like Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China are very much emboldened. And then they saw President Biden as a weak leader, and they saw this move as America retreating from the global, spheres, and then everyone started taking on their own, little agendas that they have. And if you measure the world today, the world is unsafe by every measure you want to measure it, from the economy to politics to war fighting to terrorism to conventional war to the threat of nuclear war. All of that started with the collapse of Afghanistan. That's and then as a domino effect on everything else that's happening